We don't need your numbers, Martin. We need vision. That's why I brought in people who understand strategy, not spreadsheets. Trevor Blackwood said it while scrolling through his phone, not even bothering to glance up. His office smelled like leather and expensive cologne, the kind that lingered in elevators for hours after he'd left. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline like a personal trophy case. My name is Martin Vance. I'm 51 years old. I've been the director of tax compliance at Meridian Global Holdings for 17 years, and I was about to find out exactly what Trevor thought my 17 years of institutional knowledge were worth. The meeting had been scheduled for 8:00 a.m. sharp, a calendar invite with the ominous subject line, Strategic Restructuring Discussion. In corporate America, strategic restructuring is what they say instead of "we're about to make your life harder" and pretend it's about efficiency. I'd been in enough of these meetings over the years to recognize the signs: the unusually early hour, the one-on-one format, the complete absence of any pre-meeting materials. Trevor was setting a stage, and I was walking into it blind. He finally set his phone down and gestured lazily toward the chair across from his massive walnut desk. Trevor was 42 years old, 6 months into his role as CEO, and he wore that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having faced a real consequence in his life. Wharton MBA, 3 years at a boutique consulting firm, 2 years as a VP of strategy at some private equity darling that flipped for a 9-figure exit. The board had brought him in to modernize Meridian, which everyone knew was corporate code for cutting costs and making the P&L look pretty before an eventual sale. "Sit down, Martin. This won't take long." I sat. Trevor slid a folder across the desk with 2 manicured fingers. His initials were monogrammed on the cuff of his shirt. I opened the folder and read the first line: Restructuring of the Tax Compliance Department. Below that, in the kind of sanitized HR language that always precedes bad news, consolidation of legacy functions into a streamlined strategic advisory unit under the direction of the newly hired Chief Financial Strategy Officer. "Who's the new Chief Financial Strategy Officer?" I asked, though I already had a suspicion. Trevor smiled the way people smile when they're about to enjoy watching you flinch. "Bianca Reeves. She starts Monday. Harvard MBA. 10 years at Goldman. Absolute rock star. You're going to love her." I kept my expression neutral. "And what happens to me under this new structure?" "You'll be reporting to Bianca. Same team, same responsibilities, just a new leadership layer above you. Think of it as an opportunity to focus on execution while she handles the strategic vision." I turned the page. There it was in black and white: Bianca Reeves, Chief Financial Strategy Officer. Base salary, $425,000. Signing bonus, $150,000. Annual bonus target, 40% of base. Equity grant, $600,000 vesting over 4 years. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I kept my face still. Then I glanced at my own compensation summary printed on the next page like an afterthought: Director of Tax Compliance. Base salary, $172,000. Annual bonus target, 10%, which I'd received in full exactly 4 times in 17 years. No equity. No signing anything. Just the same slow crawl of 2% merit increases that had defined the last decade of my life. I looked up at Trevor. "You realize Bianca has never worked in tax compliance, correct?" "She doesn't need to. That's your job. Her job is to make sure your work aligns with our broader financial narrative." Financial narrative. That was a new one. I filed it away in the mental folder I'd been keeping on Trevor Blackwood for 6 months, right next to synergistic value creation and growth optimization framework. Trevor leaned back in his chair, that self-satisfied smile still stretched across his face. He was enjoying this. I could tell by the way his fingers drummed slowly against the armrest, the way his eyes kept darting to my expression, waiting for a reaction he could dissect and share with his executive buddies over lunch. I gave him nothing. 17 years of dealing with IRS auditors had taught me the art of the neutral face. "Martin, look, I'll be straight with you. He leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, hands clasped like he was about to deliver a TED talk. The board and I have been reviewing the compliance function, and frankly, we think it's become too insular, too focused on the details, not enough on the big picture. Bianca is going to bring some much-needed strategic thinking to what has historically been a very transactional department. Transactional, I repeated slowly. Right. You've done great work keeping us compliant. Nobody's disputing that. But compliance is table stakes at this point. We need someone who can think about tax as a competitive advantage, not just an obligation. I looked down at the document again. There was a section titled Reporting Changes that outlined how my authority would be systematically stripped. Filing sign-offs would now require Bianca's approval. External auditor communications would route through her office. My direct line to the audit committee would be replaced by quarterly written reports submitted through Bianca. In every practical sense, I was being demoted while keeping my title. It was the kind of restructuring designed to make someone quit without triggering severance obligations. Trevor, I said carefully, I want to make sure I understand the scope of Bianca's authority over tax positions. She'll have final sign-off on all material filings. Anything above $5 million in tax impact gets her review. Everything material goes through her. Correct. Including the international transfer pricing arrangements we finalized last quarter. Including those. I let that sit for a moment. The international transfer pricing arrangements were the single most complicated piece of work I'd ever done in my career. 18 months of negotiations with tax authorities in 4 countries. A restructured intellectual property holding entity in Ireland. A carefully calibrated services agreement between our U.S. parent and our European subsidiaries. Every single number in that arrangement had been stress-tested against IRS regulations, OECD guidelines, and the specific enforcement priorities of the current administration. It was a work of art, if tax structures could be art. And it existed in a state of delicate equilibrium that only I fully understood. Trevor, some of those positions are highly technical. They rely on specific documentation and defensible methodologies. Bianca will need extensive briefing before she signs off on. Martin, he held up a hand. That's exactly the mindset we're trying to move past. You don't need to be the gatekeeper anymore. Bianca is smart. She'll figure it out, or she'll bring in outside advisors. Either way, it's not your problem. Not my problem. 17 years of building a compliance framework that had saved this company hundreds of millions of dollars, and it wasn't my problem anymore. I nodded slowly, absorbing it. There was a strange clarity settling over me, the kind you get when you finally stop pretending a situation is anything other than what it is. Can I ask what happens if I have concerns about specific positions Bianca decides to change? Trevor's smile got a little tighter. You'd raise them with her through proper channels, and if she disagrees with my assessment, then her judgment prevails. That's how leadership works, Martin. Someone has to make the call, even on positions where I've spent years building the technical foundation, especially on those. He leaned forward again. Look, I know this is a change, but you've been doing the same thing for a long time. Sometimes fresh eyes see opportunities that experienced eyes miss. That's just the reality of business. I closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. Trevor watched the gesture with a small frown, like he'd expected me to clutch it to my chest and beg for more time. Instead, I folded my hands and looked him directly in the eye. Trevor, I appreciate you being direct with me. I want to be equally direct in return. The tax positions we currently hold represent very specific interpretations of very complex regulations. Some of them are aggressive. Not illegal, but aggressive. They work because they're supported by contemporaneous documentation, specific factual patterns, and a defensible legal theory. If Bianca modifies any of those positions without understanding the underlying architecture, we could expose the company to significant regulatory risk. Trevor's expression shifted from smug to slightly irritated. Are you threatening me, Martin? No, I'm briefing you. That's still my job today, isn't it? He didn't answer. Let me be more specific. Our current effective tax rate is 14.2%. Industry average for our sector is 21%. That 7-point gap represents approximately $340 million in annual tax savings. Those savings are real, they're defensible, and they've been reviewed by external counsel and our audit firm. But they exist because of very specific structuring decisions, some of which have limited flexibility once implemented. Changes need to be made carefully, with full understanding of how the pieces interact. Which is why we have advisors. Advisors who bill $400 an hour and don't know our factual patterns. They can advise on general principles. They can't replicate the institutional knowledge of someone who's been inside this company for 17 years and knows exactly why every entity was formed. Every intercompany agreement was structured a particular way, and every valuation was performed by a specific firm on a specific date. Trevor was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised me. He laughed. Not a full laugh, more of a dismissive chuckle, but it was there. "Martin, listen to yourself. You sound like every gatekeeper I've ever encountered. Only I understand this. Only I can protect the company. You need me." He shook his head like I was a slow child. That's exactly the mentality that holds companies back. Nobody is irreplaceable. Not you, not me, not Bianca. If you left tomorrow, we'd figure it out. It might be bumpy for a week, but we'd figure it out because that's what businesses do. They adapt. I studied him for a moment. There was something almost admirable about the depth of his miscalculation. Not because he was wrong about companies adapting in general. He was right about that in the abstract. Companies do adapt, but adaptation has a cost, and the cost is inversely proportional to how well the person leaving has been treated on the way out. Someone who leaves angry doesn't just walk out the door. They walk out and take with them the 17 years of context that lives only in their head. The unwritten rules, the undocumented workarounds, the reasons certain decisions were made that never got captured in any policy manual. "You're probably right, Trevor," I said quietly. "Companies do adapt." He looked at me suspiciously, like he'd expected more of a fight and my sudden agreement was a trap. "So we're on the same page then." On the specific point that companies adapt, yes. On the broader question of whether I want to work under this new structure. That's something I need to think about. Take the weekend, but I'll need an answer Monday. Bianca is expecting a smooth transition. Understood. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out. The elevator ride down to the 22nd floor felt longer than usual. When I reached my office, I closed the door, sat down at my desk, and opened a locked drawer. Inside was a black notebook I'd been keeping for 11 years. That notebook contained everything. Not confidential company information, not trade secrets, my own personal observations, written on my own time about my own professional experiences. But it was the map, and I was the only person who had it. 11 years of tax code interpretations, IRS examiner personalities, court case developments, and my own annotated analyses of every major position we'd taken. It also contained something else. A running list of every conversation I'd had with executives about tax risk, dated and summarized, along with their responses. I flipped to a specific page from 3 years ago. The entry read, "Discussed the Cayman restructuring memo with then CFO Harold Prescott. He asked me to sign off on a valuation that used an unusual discount rate. I refused. He signed himself. Position taken on 10K currently under IRS examination. Estimated exposure, $47 million. Below that in different ink, Prescott left the company. Position remains. Documentation gaps identified." I flipped forward another few pages. Meeting with Trevor Blackwood, Ray, Q2 provision. He asked why our effective rate was so low. I explained the transfer pricing arrangement. He seemed uninterested in the details, asked only whether it was defensible. I said yes, but recommended we reduce aggression as regulatory environment tightens. He said, quote, "Keep it exactly where it is until someone forces us to change." There were pages and pages like this, dated, detailed, written in my own hand at the time of the conversation. Not evidence of any specific wrongdoing, but a comprehensive record of executive attitudes toward tax risk. The kind of documentation that a defense attorney would kill for. the kind that a plaintiff's attorney would pay handsomely to obtain through legitimate means. I closed the notebook and locked it back in the drawer. Then I opened my laptop and started composing 3 different documents. The first was my resignation letter. Simple, professional, no accusations, no drama. Effective in 14 days per my employment agreement. The second was a memorandum titled Critical Tax Positions Requiring Ongoing Attention, which listed every material position I'd worked on over the last 5 years, organized by risk level, with a brief note on each about what could go wrong if not handled properly. The third was an email to my personal attorney, Rebecca Chen, asking her to review my employment agreement, my restrictive covenants, and the specific language around post-employment confidentiality obligations. I saved all 3 documents to a personal encrypted drive and did not send them. Not yet. That evening, I drove home through Chicago traffic in a fog of quiet fury. My wife, Corinne, took one look at my face when I walked through the door and knew something had happened. Corinne had been a paralegal for 22 years before switching to consulting for law firms. She understood corporate structures, employment law, and the specific dynamics of professional workplaces better than most attorneys did. She poured me a bourbon without asking and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Tell me," I told her, "all of it. The meeting, the folder, the numbers, Bianca Reeves, the restructuring, the way Trevor had smirked when he said I wasn't irreplaceable." Corinne listened without interrupting, which was one of her many superpowers. When I finished, she took a sip of her wine and set it down carefully. "Martin, I have to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer." "Okay. How much of what you know about Meridian's tax positions is legally protected by attorney-client privilege or work product doctrine?" I thought about it. "Maybe 40%. The rest is my own analysis, my own memory of conversations, and publicly available regulatory interpretations that I happen to apply to our specific facts. And how much of what's in your personal notebook would be considered your own intellectual property versus company confidential information? Almost all of it is mine. I wrote it on personal time, on personal paper, based on my own observations." Corinne nodded slowly, thinking. "Then here's what I need you to understand. You have a fiduciary obligation to the company as long as you're an employee. That includes an obligation not to disclose confidential information, but you also have an obligation to yourself and to the public interest to not participate in ongoing or future misconduct. Those obligations sometimes conflict, and the resolution depends heavily on specific facts. I'm not planning to blow any whistles, Corinne. I just want to leave cleanly. I know. But you need to think about what happens after you leave. If they change positions you've documented as risky, and the IRS eventually comes calling, they're going to want to talk to you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you were the person who knew. And you need to be very careful about what you say and what you don't say when that happens." I nodded. She was right. She was always right about these things. I made a mental note to schedule an in-depth meeting with Rebecca Chen before I sent any resignation letter to Trevor. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 7, 30 minutes before anyone else typically got in. I went to my computer and started a very specific project. Over the course of the next 2 hours, I methodically reviewed every active tax position in our current filings, cross-referenced them against my personal notebook, and compiled a comprehensive knowledge transfer document. Not the sanitized version I'd started at home the night before. A real one. The kind that identified every landmine, every judgment call, every position that required specific documentation to survive scrutiny. I saved it to the company's shared compliance drive under the file name Tax Position Knowledge Transfer for Successor, and marked it read-only. I then sent an email to the General Audit Committee inbox, along with my direct manager, the CFO, Trevor, and our external audit partner, with a simple message. In light of anticipated organizational changes affecting the tax compliance function, I have prepared a comprehensive knowledge transfer document to ensure continuity. Please find it attached and archived in the shared compliance drive. I recommend it be reviewed by any successor before making changes to existing positions. That was step one, documenting my responsible behavior, creating a paper trail that showed I had at every point tried to protect the company's interests. It would matter later when questions started being asked. At 9:30, my phone rang. It was Trevor's assistant. "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you in his office." I took the elevator up. Trevor was standing at his window, phone to his ear, when I walked in. He waved me toward the chair and finished his call, which seemed to involve golf plans. When he hung up, he turned to me with an expression that had shifted noticeably from yesterday. He looked annoyed. "Martin, what the hell is this document you sent to the audit committee?" "A knowledge transfer memo. Standard practice when significant organizational changes affect a critical function." "You made it sound like the company is walking into a minefield." "I made it sound accurate. Every position in that document exists. Every risk I flagged is real. If Bianca is going to have sign-off authority on material positions, she needs to understand what she's signing off on." "I would think you'd want that. What I want is for you to stop trying to create a paper trail that makes the transition look risky." "The transition is risky, Trevor. That's not something I created, it's a fact." His jaw tightened. "The audit committee is now asking questions about positions they hadn't been briefed on in years. They should have been briefed on them. That's part of proper governance. If you'd like, I can prepare a summary presentation for them personally before I leave." Trevor's eyes narrowed. "Before you leave," I looked at him steadily, "I've decided not to accept the new reporting structure. I'll be submitting my resignation today, effective in 14 days per my employment agreement. I wanted to tell you in person before it went through channels." His face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds: surprise, anger, and then, most interestingly, calculation. I could almost see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how to spin this. In his mind, this was probably fine. An old, resistant employee removing himself voluntarily meant no severance to pay. It also meant he could tell the board that the restructuring had already yielded efficiency gains. "Martin, I have to say, I'm disappointed. I thought you'd see the opportunity in this transition." "I see it very clearly, Trevor. That's why I'm leaving." "Well," he straightened his tie, "I appreciate the 2 weeks' notice. That's more professional than some would give in your position. Let's make sure the handoff is smooth." "Of course. I've already started documentation. I'll continue to be available for questions during my notice period. After that, my involvement will end, and any further consultation would need to go through my attorney and be handled on a contract basis." That last sentence was carefully constructed. It planted a flag. It told him that I understood my post-employment rights, and that any attempt to compel my cooperation after my departure would come with a bill and a lawyer attached. "Understood," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't quite sure he did. I walked back to my office and sent the resignation letter formally. Within 20 minutes, HR was in my office with a stack of paperwork. Within 40 minutes, Trevor's assistant sent an email to the whole finance team announcing my departure and thanking me for my years of dedicated service. The email arrived before I'd even had a chance to tell my own team in person. Classic Trevor. Control the narrative, own the message. Make sure everyone hears his version first. I spent the rest of the day meeting one-on-one with my 3 direct reports. Julian Park, my senior tax analyst, had been with me for 8 years. He was the closest thing I had to a protege. Priya Ramaswamy handled state and local and had been with the company for 6 years. And Devin Walsh was our newest hire, only 11 months in, still learning the ropes. I told each of them the same thing, that I was leaving, that the reasons were personal and professional, that I would give them the strongest possible references, and that they should think carefully about whether they wanted to stay under the new structure. Julian took it hardest. He was 34, had a mortgage and a toddler, and had built his career under my mentorship. "Martin, is this because of Trevor?" "It's because of a lot of things, Julian. But mostly it's because I've decided that the next chapter of my career should be somewhere that values what I bring." "Are you okay financially?" I smiled. Julian was a good kid. "I'm fine. I've been quietly interviewing for a few weeks. I have options. That was mostly true. I've been having preliminary conversations with 2 firms. Nothing formal yet, but the signals had been strong. One was a Big Four accounting firm looking to add senior expertise to their advisory practice. The other was a boutique tax controversy shop in Chicago that specialized in defending corporate clients against IRS examinations. Both had made clear that they'd move quickly if I became available. Now I was available. That evening, I met Rebecca Chen at her law firm's downtown offices. Rebecca was 58, a former assistant U.S. attorney, and had specialized in employment law for the last 20 years. She'd represented me on a modest severance matter a decade ago and had been my personal counsel ever since. Rebecca listened to my summary of the last 48 hours without interrupting. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in that cramped, precise handwriting she developed during her prosecutorial days. When I finished, she set down her pen and folded her hands. "Martin, let me be blunt. You are in a much better position than you probably realize. You've done everything right. You gave notice. You created a knowledge transfer document. You flagged risks to appropriate parties. You resigned professionally. If anything goes sideways at Meridian after you leave, and I mean anything, you have a documented paper trail showing you tried to prevent it. That's what I was hopping. But," she leaned forward, "I want you to understand something very carefully. If Meridian's tax positions collapse under IRS scrutiny after you leave, and it becomes clear that they made changes without proper analysis, the IRS or the DOJ or the SEC or plaintiff's attorneys are going to want to talk to you. When that happens, you have 3 obligations. First, you must not disclose privileged information without proper legal authority. Second, you must not lie to any government investigator, not even a small lie. Third, you must not participate in any coordinated effort to obstruct or mislead an investigation. I understand. Those obligations run in different directions. Sometimes they conflict. When they do, you call me first, before you talk to anyone, before you answer any subpoena, before you sit down for any interview. Understood? Understood. Now, let's talk about your personal notebook. I'd anticipated this. It's mine. Written on personal time, on personal paper, based on my own observations and analysis. I've never disclosed its contents to anyone at the company. Does it contain any information that would qualify as trade secret under Illinois law? No. It contains my personal interpretations of publicly available tax law, applied to fact patterns I encountered at work. The facts themselves are confidential to the company. My analysis of how they interact with tax law is my own intellectual work product. Do you have any documents in it that were prepared by attorneys for Meridian? No, I've been very careful about that. If I received privileged communications, I read them, understood them, and did not copy them into personal records. Rebecca nodded slowly. Then here's what I want you to do. Take that notebook home tonight. Do not bring it back to the office. Do not reference it in any of your work at Meridian for the remainder of your notice period. Store it somewhere secure at home. And do not, under any circumstances, share any of its contents with any third party without talking to me first. If Meridian asks whether you took any documents when you left, you can honestly say no. That notebook was never company property. It was always yours. Got it? One more thing. She fixed me with the look she used to give witnesses before cross-examination. Do not initiate contact with any regulator or government agency about Meridian. Not now. Not after you leave. Not ever. If they contact you first, we handle it together and you cooperate as required by law. But you do not become a whistleblower. That's a very specific legal role with very specific procedures, and it's not the path we want here. Your goal is to leave cleanly, protect yourself, and let whatever happens at Meridian happen without your fingerprints on it. I nodded. That was exactly the advice I'd been hopping for. I wasn't out for revenge. I wasn't trying to burn the company down. I just wanted to leave with my integrity intact and let Trevor Blackwood learn on his own timeline what he'd chosen to discard. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. A weight I hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifting for 2 days now. Karen was on the couch reading when I came in. The next 14 days at Meridian were surreal. On the surface, everything was professional. I attended handoff meetings. I answered questions from my team. I wrote transition memos. I even had 2 brief interactions with Bianca Reeves, who started on the following Monday and did her best to project calm confidence despite clearly being underwater from her first day. Bianca was 36, sharp, and not unkind. In another context, I might have liked her, but she'd been handed a job she wasn't qualified for, at a compensation level that assumed expertise she didn't possess, and she was smart enough to know it. During our first meeting, she'd asked me a series of questions about the transfer pricing structure that revealed she'd read a summary but didn't understand the underlying mechanics. I answered honestly and thoroughly. I referred her to the knowledge transfer document. I told her that Julian Park would be her most valuable resource after I left. What I did not do was volunteer anything beyond what she asked. That was Rebecca's advice, and it was correct advice. On my last day, I packed a small box of personal items, a few framed photos of Corinne and our daughter Emma, a pen my father had given me when I graduated from law school, a small plant that had somehow survived 17 years on my windowsill. I did not touch the black notebook. It had gone home 2 weeks earlier, exactly as Rebecca had instructed. Julian stopped by my office at the end of the day with a card signed by the team. He hugged me, which was uncharacteristic for him. "Martin, whatever happens next, please stay in touch. And if you land somewhere that needs a senior tax analyst, please call me first. I promise." I walked out of the Meridian building at 5:47 p.m. on a Friday evening. My badge was deactivated as I exited the lobby. I did not look back. 3 days later, on Monday morning, I started my new position as Senior Managing Director at the Chicago office of Kessler Hartford, the boutique tax controversy firm. My base salary was $385,000. My signing bonus was $75,000. My billable hour target was reasonable, my clients were sophisticated, and my new managing partner, Elaine Kessler, had personally recruited me over a series of dinners the previous month. She was a former IRS deputy chief counsel who'd left the government 15 years earlier to build the firm. She was 71 years old, formidable, and made no secret of the fact that she believed institutional knowledge was the single most valuable asset in tax work. "Martin," she'd said during our final dinner, "the reason I want you here is not because you're a good technician. There are plenty of good technicians. I want you here because you spent 17 years living inside a company's tax function. You know how executives think about tax risk. You know how decisions actually get made. That perspective is worth more than any credential." I started work Monday morning with a corner office, an assistant, and a client roster of Fortune 500 companies facing IRS examinations. My first day, Elaine took me to lunch and told me to spend my first 2 weeks doing nothing but reading client files, reading pending matters, reading the firm's institutional knowledge base. She wanted me to absorb before I acted. It was, I realized, exactly how I would have onboarded a senior hire myself, the opposite of what Meridian had done with Bianca. Meanwhile, Meridian was going through a period of quiet turbulence. Julian sent me occasional text messages, carefully worded so as not to disclose anything confidential, but the general picture was clear. Bianca was struggling. Trevor was frustrated with her. The external audit firm had started asking more questions than usual. And on Bianca's third week, she'd made a decision that Julian described as, quote, "concerning." I did not ask Julian what the decision was. I did not need to. Rebecca's advice had been clear, and I intended to follow it. Whatever was happening at Meridian was no longer my problem. My job now was to build my new practice, serve my new clients, and let the natural consequences of Trevor Blackwood's choices unfold without my interference. 6 weeks after my departure, I got a call from Rebecca, not a text, a call in the middle of a workday. That was unusual. I stepped out of a meeting and picked up. "Martin, are you somewhere you can talk? Give me 2 minutes." I went to a small conference room and closed the door. "Go ahead." I received a call this morning from a criminal defense attorney named Harrison Beck. He represents Trevor Blackwood personally, not the company, Trevor personally. He wanted to know if I would agree to accept service of a subpoena on your behalf. I sat down slowly. A subpoena from whom? He wouldn't tell me, but criminal defense attorneys don't reach out about civil matters, and they don't ask about subpoenas unless a grand jury is involved, somewhere, on something. Rebecca, I have not done anything wrong. I know you haven't. That's why we're going to handle this very carefully. I told Beck that I would need to see any subpoena directly and would respond through proper channels. I did not agree to accept service. I did not confirm you were my client. I gave him nothing. What do we do now? Nothing. We wait. If a subpoena comes, we deal with it. In the meantime, do not talk to anyone from Meridian. Do not respond to any outreach from former colleagues about company matters. If anyone asks you questions about Meridian's tax positions, you refer them to me. Understood. Understood. 2 days later, I received a formal subpoena. It arrived at Rebecca's office, addressed to me care of counsel. It was issued by the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and it directed me to appear before a federal grand jury in 3 weeks. The topic, as vaguely stated in the subpoena, was financial reporting and tax compliance matters at Meridian Global Holdings. Rebecca and I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I told her everything I knew in detail on the record. She asked me hundreds of questions. She stress-tested my answers. She made me review my personal notebook page by page and identify which entries were based on my own analysis versus which contained references to privileged materials. She engaged a former federal prosecutor as co-counsel. She contacted the assistant U.S. attorney handling the matter and established a professional relationship. She did all of this without me having to make a single decision under pressure. The day I testified, I sat in the grand jury room for 4.5 hours. The prosecutors asked me questions about specific transactions, about specific individuals, about specific conversations. I answered truthfully. When questions strayed into areas covered by attorney-client privilege, I invoked it. When questions asked about my personal knowledge, I gave it. I did not volunteer anything they didn't ask about. I did not editorialize. I did not add color. I answered the questions in front of me and then I went home. 3 weeks after my grand jury testimony, the news broke. The IRS, in coordination with the Department of Justice, had frozen approximately $340 million in assets tied to Meridian Global Holdings. The freeze was pending investigation of what the government described as aggressive tax positions that appear to have been modified without adequate substantiation following a leadership transition. Meridian stock dropped 41% in a single day of trading. Trevor Blackwood was named in the news coverage. Bianca Reeves was named in the news coverage. My name was not mentioned anywhere. Rebecca had made sure of that. The 72 hours between the initial IRS action and the public announcement had apparently been chaotic inside Meridian. Julian, who by then had accepted a job offer at Kessler Hartford at my recommendation and was serving out his own notice period, sent me a single text message on the day the story broke. It's happening. Trevor is losing his mind. Bianca resigned this morning. The board is meeting in emergency session. I did not reply. There was nothing to say. Over the following months, the story unfolded in the business press in fits and starts. Meridian eventually reached a settlement with the IRS that reduced the frozen amount, but still resulted in approximately $210 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. The board terminated Trevor Blackwood in a decision described publicly as a mutual separation. Bianca Reeves, who had signed off on the position changes that triggered the examination, faced a professional inquiry by her state accounting board but was not criminally charged. She quietly relocated to another city and took a role at a private company outside the financial services sector. Trevor's name occasionally surfaced in industry gossip. He was reportedly consulting. Nobody would hire him as a CEO again. I never spoke to any of them. Not once. Not to gloat, not to explain, not to reconcile. They existed in a chapter of my life that had closed, and I felt no need to reopen it. At Kessler Hartford, my practice grew quickly. Within a year, I was leading the firm's most complex controversy matters. Julian joined my team 6 months after I started and thrived immediately. I recruited Priya Ramaswamy the following year. Elaine promoted me to partner in my second year, ahead of the typical timeline. My compensation, all in, was more than 4 times what I had made at Meridian. Karen and I paid off our mortgage. We took Emma on a 3-week trip to Europe for her college graduation. I started teaching a night class at a local law school on tax controversy practice. I began speaking at industry conferences. My professional life, at 53 years old, was more rewarding and better compensated than it had ever been. Sometimes, when I speak at conferences or teach classes, someone will ask me the question, "How do you know when it's time to leave a job?" I give them a version of the same answer every time. You know it's time when the people making decisions about your value have stopped listening to the evidence. You know it's time when someone tells you that credentials matter more than competence and expects you to nod along. You know it's time when the phrase, "we don't need your numbers," gets used about someone whose entire job is the numbers. When that happens, you have 2 choices. You can stay and try to convince them they're wrong, which almost never works. Or you can leave and let reality convince them, which almost always does. The difference between those 2 choices is the difference between spending the next decade of your life justifying your existence to people who won't be persuaded, and spending it building something meaningful in a place where you're valued from day one. I chose the second path. It cost me 17 years of pension credits and a certain amount of emotional attachment to a company I'd once considered my professional home. It saved me the rest of my career. The last thing I want you to take from this story is not about revenge. Trevor Blackwood destroyed himself. I didn't destroy him. All I did was decline to keep protecting him from the consequences of his own decisions. That's the most important lesson I can offer. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone tells you to know your place is to quietly, professionally, and completely take yourself out of the equation. And then let them discover, on their own timeline, exactly what your place was worth.